new in that member's speech except to slander the Labour opposition. Mr Speaker, Labour does have a vision for a better future where every New Zealander counts and where New Zealand's economy is going forward strongly. Mr Speaker, let me reaffirm that Labour will have a fully costed economic package which will not add to net debt and which will reduce net debt across the cycle. And Mr Speaker, this national government is the one that has failed New Zealand, failed New Zealanders, and we can see hope dying in the eyes of New Zealanders up and down the country. Mr Speaker, welcome to National's recession. Welcome to National's recession. Until yesterday, people thought the only double dip Bill English was into was his own housing allowance. Well, I'll tell you what, yesterday he discovered two more. He thought Australia was in a double dip. Well, where has he been? And he's finally admitted New Zealand is heading for a double dip recession. He's got no one left to blame. He can't blame the world economy because world markets are rising. He can't blame the Labour government because Labour's been out for 2.5 years and he's had the reins. This is National's recession. National took a bet. The bet was that China would grow and Australia would grow, and all they had to do was stand still. And our export prices would grow and New Zealand would be brought back up onto the rise. Well, some of that happened. China did grow. Australia did grow. We're at a 30-year high in export prices. But what has happened in New Zealand? Unemployment is back up to 6.8%, 150,000 more unemployed. Prices are rising faster than wages. New Zealanders at the bottom and in the middle are doing it tough and are worse off today than they were 2 years ago. And Mr Speaker, that pressure has a human face. In National's recession, the failure is best captured by McGee and Close. Remember McGee and Close? The street where John Key campaigned, the poverty that he manipulated, the promises he made. And they have said, and I quote, "He's done little to help the poor. He's just making everything better for high earners, not the low-income ones. Bread, milk and everything we need that is a basic necessity has been getting more expensive and it's getting harder for us to feed our kids." Wow. Mr Speaker, that is the voice of New Zealand. That is the voice of hope dying in the eyes of a generation. And as one young person in 4 is unable to find their first job on leaving school, as one Māori woman in 2 is locked out of the labour market, as young New Zealanders cannot find their way into their own homes, as young New Zealanders see the family silver being flogged off before their eyes, and as young New Zealanders are being told, sir, that they will have to pick up the tab for the baby boom superannuation because National hasn't got the bottle to pay into that fund, Mr Speaker. Hope is dying in the eyes of the young generation, and they will not, they know, own their own future. Mr Speaker, where are the jobs? They weren't there for Patrina Slater, who did 150 interviews and couldn't find one. They weren't there in my electorate for the Serbian scientist who has got a PhD and is delivering countdown pamphlets because that's the only job he can get. It's not there for the specialist doctors who are driving cabs around New Lynn because they are locked out of the medical profession. It is not there for the economist from Sri Lanka who is doing basic clerical work for an SOE because that's all he is allowed. It's not there for the Samoan man who lost his job at a factory in South Auckland and can't afford a state house and moved in with his brother. So there are 16 children living in one 3-bedroom house in Kelston. And it's not there for the family round the corner living in the garage that I visited not long ago, who the man is now working in a bakery thanks to some help from our office. Mr. Speaker, it is not there for New Zealanders up and down New Zealand. The double dip, Mr. English, is in New Zealand, not in Australia. Australia's doing fine because they had a good old-fashioned Labor government that invested in stimulus and job creation and R&D and getting things moving, not flogging off the silver and getting stuck in a rut of their own making. Mr. Speaker, in 2008, John Key told the grand lie that New Zealand would catch up with Australia.
Order. I know what the point of order is going to be. There's a Speaker's ruling, 42.5, which says that you cannot infer that someone has lied. I'll ask the member to withdraw and apologise.
Made the grand promise, Mr. Speaker.
No. I've asked the member to withdraw and apologise.
I withdraw and apologise. Made the grand promise, Mr. Speaker, that New Zealand would catch up with Australia. When he made it, the wage gap was 34% GDP per capita. You know what it is now? 37.5%. Rising every year on the government's own numbers. And if you don't believe me, believe the 36,000 New Zealanders that left for Australia last year alone. And that happens to be a higher number than in 6 of the 9 years of the last Labor government. The exodus is going up. Hope is dying in the eyes of New Zealanders. Food prices are rising faster than wages, and more New Zealanders are on the unemployment heap. And this government laughs. Hekia Parata laughs. She laughs because she's got the LTDs, she's got the $250,000 salary, she's sitting pretty, and she's getting out of touch with mana. That's why she's not the MP for mana. It might be reminded that laughing doesn't last when New Zealanders are suffering. Mr. Speaker, those in work are doing it hard. Last year, wages rose 1.7% and inflation was 4%. It doesn't take a PhD to work out that means people are nearly 2.5% worse off. Wages went backwards on average 2.5%. They were cut 2.5% under National. Simple, can't be argued with, except Bill English tries. He manipulates the numbers to say wages after tax since they got elected have gone up. You know how he did that, my colleagues have asked me? Firstly, he took a starting date before they got elected, in the year in which we were still governing. Then he added back in the effect of Labor's budget 2008 tax cut. And then he used a different data series in the comparison with Australia, and then he dropped out their tax cuts, which the country couldn't afford, and they've had to borrow to fund. Mr. Speaker, when you take the proper New Zealand Income Survey data, it shows that average incomes grew about 5 to 6% per annum under Labor, and under National 0.4% for the average, and minus 7.75% for the median. So that's 50% of New Zealanders, at least, have gone backwards since they got elected. You can't argue with those numbers. That's the data. Mr. Speaker, welcome to National's recession, the one in which there's no global financial crisis left to blame and where they've had their hand on the tiller for 2.5 years. And where is their plan? Where is the plan for jobs and growth? Well, it was to take away the R&D tax cuts and appoint a chief scientist. It was to take away half of the grant funds of the Ministry of Economic Development. I tried to ring the Economic Development Agency in Waitakere, and I couldn't get through. Mr. Speaker, do you know why? Because Rodney Hyde abolished it. He simply abolished it in the Super City legislation. There is no Economic Development Agency left in West Auckland. They don't care. They would rather prevent Māori from having an elected seat on the Super City Council and spend $5 million on an advisory board. Can we have that money to create jobs in West Auckland, Mr. Speaker? That would be very, very, very helpful. The problem is for National, and I know they're looking at their feet because they don't like the truth, is that they are still in the grip of Reagan-Thatcher Chicago school economics. And the theory goes, if you just cut, now listen to this one, Mr. Power, if you just cut government sector enough. A million flowers will bloom, interest rates will drop, the current account will be beautiful and everything will be right in the garden. You know, latest international data shows that for every one public sector job, 2 private sector jobs are created. 1 on average for procurement from public sector activity and 1 more from the multiplier effect of lifting aggregate output. The multiplier. That is what economists discovered after the last Great Depression, which says when government gets in and helps, people get confident and they invest themselves. And they hire people and they build things and they make things and they sell things and we get out of the doldrums, we get out of the rut. Why have they forgotten the lesson of the 1930s? The lesson that Forbes and Coates taught us, and it took Michael Savage to put right. And it took Michael Cullen to cut New Zealand's debt to 0. They've complained, Mr. Speaker, that New Zealand left a pile of debt. There was a credit
Sorry to interrupt the member.
debt
His time has expired.
when we left office, Mr.